Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Orlando Bloom's boxer puts his body on the line when he tries to make the cut. 10 years ago, the unnamed boxer played by Orlando Bloom lost his big title fight and retired. Now he's been given another chance by promoter Donnie, played by Gary Beadle, as a last-minute replacement for another boxer who has died, so long as he hits the limit for the weight class in a week. But as time runs out, the boxer turns to ruthless trainer Boz, played by John Turturro, who will do whatever it takes, no matter how extreme and dangerous. The Cut is the latest film directed by Sean Ellis, who directed Cashback and Anthropoid, and it was the opening night film at the Toronto International Film Festival back in 2024, now finally hitting cinema screens a year later. And let's make one thing very clear at the start. This is not a boxing movie, or at least not in the traditional sense anyway. You've probably seen some of the posters with boxing rings and Bloom in his trunks and gloves getting ready to do rounds, and this isn't really that movie. This ain't Rocky. Sure, the premise might sound familiar at first glance. A boxer who thinks he's missed his chance gets a miraculous title shot as an underdog comeback kid, and I'm sure the similarities are intentional so the film can hit you with a right hook, knock you to the floor, and then scream in your face, "This ain't no fantasy, this is reality!" If anything, it might be the anti-Rocky, because it almost exclusively focuses on all the stuff those films leave in a training montage, which is the bout before you even step into the ring to fight. Instead of an upbeat set of highlights, The Cut is all about the grind, a succession of ever bleaker lowlights as we journey into the dark side of the ring. In Rocky it was Gonna Fly Now, but if The Cut had a theme song, it would likely be Gonna Vom Now. The Cut is a pretty scathing indictment of the boxing world where corruption reigns supreme. They don't care about the fighter's well-being, they need a body in that ring because they've got all the money and sponsors invested in the event. That's the mindset of Gary Beadle's promoter, who was very obviously inspired by Don King right down to his name. Underneath all the bright lights and glamour of a Las Vegas title fight, he's got a notorious reputation for his shady, unscrupulous practices. The extremes that the boxer go through are not just unethical, they're increasingly illegal, and they're treated as an open secret by Donnie and his team. Hell, he actively encourages it and witnesses it during the film. He just wants the fight to go ahead as planned and doesn't care how. It's a business that puts bodies on the line, chews people up, and when they're done, just moves right on to the next body. This isn't the first sports movie to focus on its seedy underbelly, with the most obvious point of comparison being Foxcatcher, especially that film sequence where Channing Tatum is pushing himself to try and make his weight class. Imagine a whole film centered around that one bit and you pretty much got the cut. But mostly the film functions as a showcase for Orlando Bloom, who easily gives one of his best performances in this film, and certainly the most committed he's ever been. And I'll fully admit that I've not rated Bloom especially highly as a dramatic actor in the past. He had that kind of clean-cut pretty boy image from his work in The Lord of the Rings and Pirates of the Caribbean, which were physically demanding action roles, but he was in ensembles where he was often overshadowed by his co-stars, especially Johnny Depp in Pirates. Bloom never quite broke out into the massive star he was poised to be at that time, but recently Bloom's been having a bit of a comeback himself, and maybe he felt a bit of a connection between himself and the character that he's playing, because his performance in The Cut is just as determined to prove himself, and he is absolutely ferocious in this. You can see it physically as Bloom did the cut that the boxer does in this movie, although needless to say in a slower, much more healthy way than what happens on screen. Apparently they filmed the movie in reverse order, so he got into the shape that he needed to for the ending and then worked backwards from there. But the actual emotional performance is much more subtle because the boxer is very internalised. Indeed, that's the question that the movie is asking. What drives someone to do this and push themselves so hard, to depersonalise themselves completely for the sake of their goal, hence why the boxer is unnamed and anonymised during the film. What the movie suggests is that burning desire, that hunger for accomplishment, it's usually to try and fill a gaping void within a person that they need something to fill it with. And the boxer has a whole lot of unprocessed trauma that just tumbles right out of him at the tiniest provocation. We see in flashbacks his childhood at the height of the Troubles, where he was a bullied, frightened kid who was often found getting beaten up. His mother, played by Claire Dunn, tells him that there are two kinds of people in this world: the people who get hurt and those that hurt them first. And clearly the boxer was determined to be the latter, but that hasn't stopped him from being severely damaged. Those scars never really went away, he's just buried it under his muscles and bravado. I do think it's telling that one of the best scenes in the movie is one where the boxer's wife Caitlin, played by Katarina Balfe, gets him to actually open up for once about his feelings. There's some genuine emotion between Balfe and Bloom in that scene, which is too often caged up in aggression, and Balfe is often the unfortunate victim of that, in a role which doesn't give her much to do. Caitlin is the daughter of a tough trainer who wanted sons instead. She's grown up amongst boxing, but she has the mettle to stand up for herself in a man's world. But that has also damaged her, and she's a recovering addict who went clean when she fell in love with the boxer. That void, that hurt, that desire to be loved was filled at that point, and it gave her something to fight for. But the unfortunate thing is, it didn't do the same for the boxer. His need for the validation of the belt means that he doesn't truly appreciate her fighting in his corner, and he keeps pushing her away and burning bridges with his entourage. And so the Outlander star is constantly playing the same scene, one where she tries to impose a limit on how far her husband is going to go, which is then ignored and then steamrolled over again and again and again until she simply cannot take it anymore. It's the thankless task of having to be the voice of reason, but the backstory they've given her can't make up for that, when the relationship between her and Bloom should have been at the heart of this movie, but it's underdeveloped. And I've mentioned Foxcatcher already, but speaking of 2014 Oscar nominees, the cut owes an enormous debt to Whiplash, which is pretty much the boxing movie version of. When John Turturro enters the movie, he's essentially doing J.K. Simmons' bit. He may not fill the air with profanity-laden screaming, but he's the same kind of emotionally manipulative bully, just in a quieter but similarly intense register. Boz is like the devil on the shoulder, always constantly trying to shame the boxer out of quitting and being negative. Instead of asking if he's rushing or dragging, he warns the boxer, there is no ripcord. Once he starts, he doesn't stop, and he's true to his word. Turturro knows how to play a slimeball villain, and he gladly chews on the scenery as he forces the boxer through an ever more punishing regime of sauna trips, blood drains, dodgy substances, and even worse, it's do or die. And as the boxer gets weaker and more exhausted, barely even conscious at times towards the end, the more Turturro dominates the film. In later scenes where he's bathed in a sickly green light, Turturro's smile looks practically demonic. But what Turturro isn't able to do is make the character feel believable. Even with the corruption of the boxing world, someone who is completely immoral and reckless as Boz feels very over the top. At one point, Caitlin threatens to get his boxing license suspended, which is a fair point. How does he still have that? His methods are so extreme barbaric that he nearly kills the boxer a couple of times from pushing him too hard. In fact, those are the few moments where he seems to have a flicker of humanity, or at least some kind of panic guilt, but that's probably from knowing that his career would be over if it did. But he just doesn't seem like a person. There's some very brief lines that imply that he's come from a broken, abusive background himself, but he's more a caricature than anything real. The nuance just simply isn't there in the writing or the performance. Even Simmons in Whiplash wasn't a taskmaster all of the time. Which brings us to the fundamental problem with the cut in that it just doesn't feel especially plausible. Already the premise where Bloom's boxer has to lose over 30 pounds in the space of a week stretches credibility, but a lot of what happens after is so strenuous that he's hardly even able to stand. And we're meant to believe that he's going to have a title fight naturally last when he's almost knocking on heaven's door in the final hours before the bout. At times, what happens in the film borders on abject body horror, and maybe the gloves of realism should have come off, because trying to ground this actually makes it seem more implausible. There's moments where the boxer is hallucinating that his opponent is taunting him in the hallway, and some stylish moments like a shot where a dozen Blooms training fill the corridor. But maybe it would have been smarter to lean into the surrealism, something like The Substance for Men. Apparently Ellis did actually trim back the body horror that went too far, but the movie is in a weird space where it ends up being both too much and not enough simultaneously. This is especially true during the climactic weigh-in, which is a literal cut too far, and my suspension of disbelief just totally snapped at that point. It's meant to be the shocking moment, but either you do that as a grotesque final punchline that ends the film, or you don't do it at all, because it's absolutely ridiculous. Somehow the movie keeps going for a couple more scenes, even though it makes no sense whatsoever, because there's no way things would be allowed to continue after that point. But I also found the movie somewhat disappointing as an examination of toxic masculinity and obsession, which it's clearly gesturing towards, because while it shows the boxer's damaging behaviours, it doesn't really explore it. There's a point where the boxer talks to a sick child in the hospital, and he utters the film's tagline, "Your body is a tool, mind over matter, and victory begins in the head." But clearly the boxer's mind is sick, and what he's doing isn't resilience, it's punishment. The movie needed a moment where he truly recognises that he's hit rock bottom to give some emotional heft to him trying to take the steps to come back from the brink. Certainly there's never a moment where he finally rejects Boz's control over him. Instead, it all feels rushed into the final scene, and it does seem like the ending might have been reconfigured. There's no big boxing scene at the end, which is fine for a movie which isn't really about that, but it seems like they might have done at one point, because we see these sporadic flash forwards of Bloom in the ring, and they look like trims from a much longer ending that have been repurposed throughout the movie because they're intense. You know, these shots of Bloom screaming in tight close-ups, but they're not consistently used enough to be a visual metaphor. And what's worse is that the ending wants to have its cake and eat it. The whole film is meant to have us shocked about how far the boxer will go and the lengths that sports people will go at the cost of themselves and those around them, but then also implies that the ends justified the means. It's a confused and contradictory ending that undermines what the film is trying to accomplish and doesn't really satisfy. The cut is easily some of the best work that Orlando Bloom has done today, and it's a performance that has actually made me reassess him as an actor somewhat. Certainly it's far different from the last time he played a boxer in the goofy mockumentary The Calcium Kid, although, hilariously, they do appear to have used one of the promo stills from that movie very early on. But Bloom's holding up a film that is very uneven and, while ambitious, doesn't quite know what it wants to say ultimately. Certainly the script needed a few cuts of its own and better expansion upon its character and themes, which are grueling, but they're also surface level. The film isn't a knockout, but Bloom is here, and he seems to be growing into a promising character actor. If you like this review and you want to support my work, you can give me a tip at my Ko-fi page, or my YouTube Super Thanks feature, which is right below the video. Or you can keep me in fighting shape over on my Patreon, where you can see my videos early among other perks, including access to my Discord server, and you can also join YouTube memberships for similar perks. Or you can just simply like, share and subscribe, and even hype the video now. I'm losing track of all these YouTube things. Anyway, until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.